Gradients allow you to create a transition between two different colors in Illustrator. In addition, you can control varying levels of opacity to create great-looking artwork. Let's take a closer look at gradients. Now, I'm beginning my video with the gradients.ai file already open on my computer. And I'm going to come over here to the Layers panel because what I'd like to do to start is apply a gradient to the mountains that are in this artwork. But it's a little bit busy and I'd like to just focus on those components for now. So here's a little tip in Illustrator. If you only want to see the contents on one layer, you can Option click or Alt click on Windows on the visibility icon, and that'll only show the contents of that layer. And then if you Alt or Option click again, it'll show everything on the other layers. So I'm going to Alt or Option click so I can focus on the mountains here, and then I'm going to zoom in on this artwork. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my gradient panel. So I'm going to go to the window menu and I'm going to choose gradient. And for now I'm going to keep this as a free floating panel. And I'm going to select one of my pieces of artwork. You can see it's just a basic path that's filled with green right now. But in the gradient panel, in the drop-down menu here, I can choose between a linear gradient, or a straight line if you will, or a radial gradient, which goes from the center out, or vice versa. So in this example, I want to use a linear gradient, and you can see that by default, it's going to apply a gradient that goes from white to black. Now, what we can also do is we can change the angle of the gradient. So if I click on the drop-down menu, I can choose, I'm going to go with -90. And actually, you can see that I want it to go from dark up here to light down here. So we actually want 90. Go ahead and choose that option. And now at least we have the gradient going in the right direction. Now the next thing I want to do is, instead of going from white to black, I want it to go from white to green. And I should point out here that you can add color stops, which is what these are down here. If I click in an area below the gradient ramp, it's just going to add another color stop that I can apply. Now for this gradient, I just want 2 color stops, so I'll just click on this and drag out to remove it. And then I'm going to double click on the black color stop here. And you have these 2 buttons here that allow you to choose between a standard color. You can use the ramp here. You can even go into the different RGB or CMYK color modes if you wish. But in my case, I have a swatch that I want to use. So I'm going to click on the swatch, and then I'm going to choose the green color in my swatches panel. And you can see that now it's going from green to white. And that's good. So we'll click back out in our gradient panel. And now what we can do is we can tweak this a little bit. So it's going from white to green, but this guy right here allows me to adjust the transition between the white and black on this gradient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the transition slider. You can see that as I do this, I'm getting more of the green because I'm allowing less of the white to show through. And I'm going to pull that down to something like 18% or so, maybe 16 to 18%, and that looks pretty good. Now the one thing I want to do here, and I'm just going to show you this, I'm going to draw a rectangle over top of this. I'm just going to fill it with a color. Let's use like a tan. If I go to Object, Arrange, and choose Send to Back, we can see that if this mountain appears over any other artwork, it's going to be white at the bottom. Well, I'd like it to show through. I'd like it to look a little more integrated into my artwork. So I'm going to click on the mountain again to select it. Go back to our gradient panel. And what we can also do is if we click on one of these color stops, so in my example I'm going to click on the white color stop, you can see that in addition to choosing the color, I can also choose the opacity. The location is the location on the ramp. So, if I drag this to the right, the location is going to move up, on the ramp. So I'll keep that down here. But for opacity, I'm going to click on this and choose 0%. And so basically now what's happening is I'm allowed to see through the artwork. Because I set the opacity of that color stop to 0%, I now can see through the artwork to the color behind it. And that's just going to make this artwork a little more flexible as I continue to use it. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this tan object because this is really what I want it to look like. So what I'm going to do is, with this selected, I'm going to open up my swatches panel. And what I can do now is I can drag this gradient either from the gradient panel or from the fill indicator here. I'm going to drag it and drop it into my swatches panel. And now I have a swatch that is defined with these properties. And what that does for me is that now I can zoom out a little bit, and I'm able to quickly select more than one object and apply the same gradient swatch to it. You'll notice that the angle does not get saved. So I need to change the angle here. I'll just change it to 90. But now I can quickly and easily get to the gradient look and feel that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to change some of these. There we go. Now, the other thing I want to point out is you can fine-tune these mountains. So it looks like I forgot a couple right here. Let's apply those. You can fine-tune the gradient once it's applied. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to click on one of these objects. And if you click on the gradient tool, you're going to notice a new option shows up here called the gradient annotator. Just going to slide these panels out of the way. And the gradient annotator, when you hover over it, you can see that it's showing you the exact same thing that you see in the gradient panel, but it's showing you how it's applied to the object. So for example, I could drag the transition slider and kind of change how it's applied individually. And I can also drag the color stop to change how it's applied as well. If I double click on the color stop, I can still make all the same changes that I did before. And you can even click on this indicator here and you can drag this over. You can pull it in, you can reposition it and change how it's applied to your object. So the other thing you can do too, if you have this need, is if I select more than one object and I choose the gradient panel, I can actually click and drag across two selected items, and it's going to apply one gradient to both items as a unit. So this is another great way you can incorporate gradients into your artwork as well. Now I'm just going to go ahead and undo that because I want it to be the way that it was, and I'll press Command 0. Let's go ahead and take a look at creating a radial gradient. So I'm going to go to my layers panel, and I have a layer that I have called shadows. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the mountain layer, turn on the shadows layer, so we can see what these shadows look like. So I'm just going to zoom in on one of these shadows. And we'll make sure that our gradient panel is still displayed. So I'm going to click on one of these objects, and this time I'm going to choose a radial gradient. And you can see here that this particular gradient is going from white in the middle to green on the outside. And in this case, I actually want the opposite because these are supposed to be shadows for the smaller trees and plants in this project. So what I can do is I can click on this button here to reverse the gradient. Okay, so now I'm going opposite. Now I'm going green on the inside to white on the outside. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to adjust the transition slider. So I'm going to put that more towards the center right now. And then what I can also do is I can adjust the aspect ratio. Now I'm going to change the aspect ratio to about 12%. And if I press Enter, you can see it adjusts the width to height aspect ratio of this gradient. And so now you can see that I've kind of squished it to create a little bit of a shadow, a really cool shadow looking project here. So that's exactly what I want here. But what I also want to do is I'm going to double click on the white color stop, and I want to make sure that the opacity is set to 0%. So if yours is not, just go ahead and set that to 0%. This color stop should be 100%. And that's going to give me the same type of effect as with the mountains where it's going to kind of fade out from there. So I think that looks pretty good. I think I might drag the transition slider up to about 60. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And now, just as we did before, we can save this as a swatch. So you can go ahead and go to the swatches panel, drag this into the swatches panel, And now you can reapply this to other objects. So let's see how that works. I'm going to go ahead and move the gradient panel down, press Command 0 on Mac or Control 0 on Windows. And I'm just going to press Command A on my keyboard or Control A on Windows to select all of these shadows. I'm then going to click on the gradient that I created here, and that's going to apply all of the gradients to the same objects. Now, you'll notice once again that most of the properties have been saved, but one of the things that it hasn't saved is the aspect ratio because we have multiple values. So I'm just going to click in that field, and I'm going to type 12 and press Enter, and now you can see that all of those shadows have been applied appropriately. And so now, if you go ahead and go to your Layers panel, and we turn on the remainder of these layers, we get a better idea of how this is looking in our overall artwork. As you can see, you can save a lot of time by saving gradients as gradient swatches and then fine-tuning them using the gradient annotator. I encourage you to make the most of this feature when working with your own artwork as well.